So good morning, welcome to the 10th EPRC webinar for this year. My name is Nelly Georgieva and I'm a research associate at the EPRC. In normal circumstances, pre-COVID time, these seminars have been taking place face-to-face at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And we are looking forward to doing those again in the future. But in the meantime, we are happy to make use of this opportunity to hold our seminars online and welcome audiences from different parts of Europe. So we are very happy to see you today and hopefully in future webinars as well. Today, we are delighted to have two speakers. These are Alison Hunter and Marta Pilati. Welcome to both of you. They will be sharing research and findings at on the topic of green recovery, prospects for EU least advantaged regions. So we would first hear their presentation and then we would open the floor for questions and comments from the public. And we aim to finish at 12 o'clock UK time or 13 at Central European time. If you'd like to make an intervention during the discussion, please use the Zoom raise hand function, or equally feel free to use the chat to pose your questions or comments as we go. Before introducing our speakers, I would like to inform you that this session is being recorded, and this is in order to allow people that haven't been able to join us today to watch it at a later stage. The recording will be posted on YouTube channel and all participants will be informed by email. It's also encouraged that you share on Twitter, so we spread the word on the work that Alison and Marta have been doing. So let me now present our speakers. Alison Hunter is a joint owner and director of a Brussels-based consultancy called Economic and Public Policy Consultancy, specializing in EU and policy analysis. She's a senior advisor to a Brussels-based think tank, the European Policy Center, in the fields of regional policy, innovation, and industrial growth. And she's also a board member of a Brussels-based policy research lab, the European Strategic Innovation System Center. Marta Pilati is a policy analyst at the European Policy Center since 2018. Her areas of expertise include economic and regional policy, the EU recovery package and the EU budget, as well as industrial and research and innovation policy. So with this introduction, I now give the floor to Alison and Marta for their presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you today. We're really looking forward to the discussion and to sharing with you our thoughts on this topic. So I'll just hand over to Marta, who's going to take you through some of her introductory slides. Then she'll hand back to me, and then Marta will conclude, leaving plenty of time for discussion. So over to you, Marta.
Thanks and good morning, everyone, and thanks, Nelly and the EPRC for this invite. Let me just share my screen so that I can share the PowerPoint I have with you. I believe you are seeing this. Yes. Great. Well, as Alison just said, I'll start and then give the word to her. Maybe before we start, just a couple of words on the European Policy Center. We are one of the biggest think tanks in Brussels. We work on different areas of European policy. We provide independent analysis. We foster the debate on different European policy areas. And as I mentioned, in particular, we work on regional industrial policy and then economic EU budget policy. So today our presentation is about disadvantaged regions and their prospect for economic recovery and successful green transition. But first, who are the EU's disadvantaged regions? I have two screens, that's why I'm sorry. So if you see me moving, it's just because I have the presentation here. I want to just give you a glance of a paper that Alison and I wrote for the European Parliament's Regi Committee last year on EU lagging regions. And here we tried to define what lagging really means. And to do that, we looked at GDP performance over time to identify different types of regions in Europe. And so we came up with this new typology. And I'll skim through this, but I'm happy to provide more detail. So in red, you'll see the divergent regions that are poorer than the EU average and are also growing less than average, which means that this is where disparities are increasing. And of course, as you see, there is a very strong geographical concentration in the south of Europe, but also elsewhere, notably Belgium, Ireland. In Eastern Europe, the picture is different. And this is why poorer regions are catching up with the EU average, even though there are some areas, and these are the striped ones, where you can see that there is internal divergence, which means that some of the areas of these countries are growing faster than others. And usually it's the capital regions that are converging faster to EU average, creating some internal disparities. And there are also some countries, and here the last category that you see dotted, notably Greece and Italy, that are characterized by extremely low relative growth in all of the territories. So here we can see that there is a persistent issue at national level. But as I said, happy to maybe come back to some of this later. So what do we know? So this was, of course, before COVID. So what do we know about the impact of the COVID crisis? Clearly, this is still largely unknown. We don't know what the situation will be in a few years' time. We don't know how the recovery will be, successful, unsuccessful, uneven in different areas. But I think there are clear indications that there is a risk that the recovery will not be the same across the EU, and that there are areas that will struggle more to bounce back. And most likely these areas will be the ones that are already more vulnerable before the pandemic. So there is a chance to that the consequence of this crisis will exacerbate disparities. And to this development, of course, there are also the structural changes that are brought by the green and digital transitions, which add complexity and challenges. And I think it's important to remember that these challenges, so the ones brought by COVID, the ones brought by the green and digital transitions, they come on top of pre-existing vulnerabilities. So these pre-existing vulnerabilities have not disappeared, but rather might be exacerbated by new challenges. And I've linked here the link and the title of our study for the Regi Committee in case you want to have a look. I want to move now to what's going on in this month, so the Recovery and Resilience Facility. As I'm sure you know, there is a lot of hope on the Recovery and Resilience Facility, also to reduce the risk of uneven recovery. And here I just want to mention a couple of points that are more relevant to this discussion. Of course, there are many more that could be made, but just for the sake of time. So first, I think the facility has at least brought an increased awareness of territorial disparities, of the risk of divergence, which I think is very welcome. The very logic on which the facility is built on is that more vulnerable states, the ones that have been affected more strongly by the crisis, will receive more support. So there is an intrinsic redistribution logic that supports the most vulnerable areas. And And cohesion objectives are, at least on paper, and in particular in some countries, well recognized and taken relatively seriously. Again, at least on paper. So this is for sure a welcome development, but we shall see. And in fact, it's not clear what kind of territorial impact assessment has been done and what kind of territorial impact assessment is foreseen to understand where exactly the investments are in forms will have an impact and whether they will be directed to in different forms to different types, for example, of regions. And for example, we can see already from the recovery plans that while some measures in some countries are geographically targeted, many are nationwide intervention. And the risk with nationwide intervention is that they are not territorially sensitive enough. So there is a risk that untargeted measures will end up benefiting the areas that are more advanced, while the ones that are less advanced will not benefit as much from these untargeted measures. We can also expect a new role for the European semester, although we shall see what reforms to the semester will be put in place to integrate the assessment and the implementation of the recovery plans. Clearly, this is an opportunity for a stronger semester because it has never been associated with funding. And there is also a chance to include a greater territorial element to it. And lastly, before I hand over to Alison, there have been some tensions, notably between the need to quickly prepare the recovery plans and the quality of the content. Some of our work we did at EPC, which is also titled and linked here, showed that there has been relatively limited consultation of stakeholders, including regional authorities. This, of course, varies across countries, but we can see this general pattern. And I think that to remedy to this, now it's too late because the plans are written, but there needs to be more transparency and more dialogue in the implementation phase to make sure that all concerned actors are taken into account. So I'll hand over to Alison now for a few more points, and then I'll come back with some concluding messages. Alison, please.
Thanks, Marta. Could you, yeah, thank you. I've just got a couple of slides here which are looking in a bit more depth at what we see as being some of the challenges, particularly for the EU's least advantaged territories in facing this green recovery in the context of the global health pandemic. We hear a lot about this term, green recovery, probably less about what it means, because clearly it means very different things to different places, depending, excuse me, on your starting point. And just probably for a bit of context there, the recent European Commission spring economic forecast has already projected unemployment rates in Greece of 16%, Spain 14 to 16%, Italy somewhere between 9 and 10%. And these three countries will probably face the greatest hit to GDP going forward. They certainly did in 2020. And much of the work that we did with the lagging regions work for the European Parliament actually focused quite significantly on these three countries. So there's no surprise there about an ongoing relationship. But back to this point about what does a green recovery look like? Well, the least advantaged and the most vulnerable places unquestionably are facing the biggest challenges in addressing these twin transition objectives of energy and digital transition. But the idea of understanding the distance between what are their respective baselines and what a green recovery will actually look like in these places is incredibly difficult, because we know that these territories face multifaceted challenges, including energy, digital domains, but they also have underpinning weaknesses due to a lack of a core reform agenda in areas such as administrative capacity, health systems, transport, education skills, research and innovation. So it's an incredibly complex area to move and to understand, and indeed also to measure. And as I said, we've seen a bit too much generalisation of what does a green recovery mean, and the links between reforms in this agenda and a focus on visible actions such as digital infrastructure and low carbon technologies. So we hear a lot from probably the member states who have the least problems to address around digital infrastructures, low carbon technologies. But this probably understates the more fundamental role for reforms in the places with the least advantages. And these are back to issues about healthcare, social security, labour market and job search support, etc. So there's a very, very uneven playing field when we talk about embracing this green recovery. And because of that, there's a risk at the EU level that we actually overlook the challenges and possibly even the successes at the local level in these least advantaged places, because it will be difficult to capture performance, which is only through the recovery and resilience plans only being captured at the national level. So we perhaps risk understating, or in some cases maybe even overstating, local progress and performance. And in turn, this can affect appetite to sustain the reform momentum at the regional level, especially for those places that have the most work to do and have, in fact, the most pain to go through to endure in the wider reform process. So we're actually hearing a lot less about that in the current debate and dialogue, which is potentially unhelpful and rather dangerous. There are multiple challenges in these places, and these places are continuing to respond to the crisis as it unfolds, and they're still planning at the same time for the medium and long-term recovery, which is in and of itself incredibly difficult, because we know that both will have to be addressed at the same time. But this is somewhat subject to ambiguity at the EU level, because the recovery and resilience plans objectives state clearly there's a need to address social, economic and territorial cohesion. But the Commission's message has been to avoid confusing crisis response with the main focus of recovery plans. It's incredibly difficult to separate these out, and this intervention logic seems a bit fuzzy and doesn't make a lot of sense, especially not to these places who have the most challenges to address. Richer member states, of course, might be able to manage and finance COVID response and green recovery challenges separately, but the extent of the problem in the least advantaged places makes it quite unrealistic to assume that a green recovery phase can be activated at the same time as responding to the crisis which is still underway. So there's quite a complex agenda going on in that whole space at this particular time. There's also growing evidence that pre-existing challenges in these least advantaged places, as Marta has said, are being exacerbated by the crisis, and they could be creating further EU fragmentation and a sharper contrast between what we term as these winners and losers. So the EU continues to face acute challenges in areas such as the innovation divide, the digital divide, capacity for energy transition, poor capacity for reforms in some places, and disenchanted young people. And the problem is not the same in every place, as we know, across the EU. Some places face these challenges in a much worse way, and these tend to be the least advantaged places. And furthermore, job losses and disruptions that are caused by COVID and the harshest labour market changes, which are being caused by green transitions, are expected to be geographically concentrated. And if these overlap, so the same places affected by double job losses, this could put these places at a further disadvantage and could even paralyse attempts to respond. So the policy-making environments of the least advantaged places are often very weak. I think it is rather obvious. And they tend to reinforce the long-term absence of that effective reform agenda, for example, in health and social systems. So a painful reform process is unlikely to be welcomed in these places, yet it is somehow inevitable that it has to be embraced. Long-term planning and strong leadership is likely to be required in these territories to stay the pace with the reform agenda, but there's also quite strong risks of political instability, which can make reforms more difficult to implement. That can affect the speed, the direction, and the certainty of responses. And until very recently, of course, we saw this was the position in Italy. It was a classic example where political instability restricted the emergence of effective policy responses at a time when they were needed the most. And in fact, these issues are beginning to re-emerge in Italy, linked to public procurement rules for financing public works. This is something just in the last few days that has re-emerged. So it's an incredibly complex political agenda. Structural changes that are caused by the crisis are also impacting on economic sectors and related jobs, exposing reform needs. And we know that some of the EU's most vulnerable places are highly dependent on jobs that have been worse affected, for example, in hospitality and tourism sectors. For the low-skilled experiencing job displacement or disruption, there are few other job options where the labour market has become depressed. And these are places characterised by economic sectors with very traditional business models. So that can also prevent a rapid business renewal or even diversification of the economic structures. So, and added to this, we have the health and social systems, which are under significant strain. And faced with weak social safety nets, there are gaps in protecting the most vulnerable citizens. So the problems are in effect kind of perpetuating. So this long-term absence of reform in these places has left inadequate support and protection in this time of crisis, and this suppresses the potential for these places and for the people in these places to bounce back. So it's that's a rather gloomy picture that I've painted there. Can we move to the sorry, just before we move to the last point there about the EU response package. This is not to understate that the Recovery and Resilience Facility is not absolutely novel, unprecedented and incredibly valuable, but it may not be moving in the right direction for the least advantaged places in the EU. And I think there are at least 3 things that need to be unpacked within that whole facility. The first is, and Marta already alluded to it, there is a need for a fundamental review of place-based investment to support structural transformation. And there's no clear evidence at this stage that the recovery and resilience plans from the member states have actually gone through this process. So we risk poorly targeted policies and investments, and of course generating then poor returns. The second point about the package is the need to deliver a coherent and coordinated reform agenda, which needs to address fundamental reforms to provide a legacy from the COVID response package, but which will allow for a smoother implementation of the Green Deal's twin transition reform agenda. Now, the technical support instrument, which is kind of going hand in hand, being delivered through DG reform, is there and is actually being picked up at the national level, but the actions there are member state driven. There's no clarity that this is actually addressing the responses that are required by the places that need it the most, and that targeted support is taking place. It tends to be very much a nationally led, nationally driven instrument. And the third area that the response package really needs to address for the longer term is an investment plan in these places for their longer term future in addressing twin transitions. And this is really about improving the health and attractiveness of the wider investment environment. It needs to look at areas such as venture capital, FDI, private investment. And these are areas that we know within the least advantaged territories, they have really struggled, not even just recently, but over a long period of time. So this would be an ideal place where the technical support instrument should actually be directed, but there's little evidence of that taking place right now. Marta, could we move to the next slide, just to talk about potentially some of the things that might be able to help? The first point there is about the need for the Commission to reinforce its commitment to no person or place left behind. It's been a mantra since the new Commission has been in place, and indeed since the plans for the new cohesion policy for post-2020 have been in place. But to make that a reality, we will need to have better evidence of a genuine place-based sensitivity to EU policy making and support instruments. And that implies action at all levels of governance. The rhetoric of top-down meeting bottom-up is being significantly challenged at this time now in COVID response efforts and in the design of the recovery and resilience plans. And there's a very significant need to monitor how this is going to play out. And this will need to be championed by the wider territorial cohesion community to emphasise and demonstrate that the process matters as an enabler of change and reform and recovery. This could, of course, be a key focus for the 8th Cohesion Report, and it should be a strong feature of engagement with the upcoming Conference of Europe. So there's scope for a greater level of debate and discussion about these challenges at the EU level. There's also a need for improved EU interinstitutional dialogue. The Parliament, we know, has a clearly stated role with the Recovery and Resilience Facility. We know that the Parliament and the Commission are expected to hold structured dialogue every 2 months, where MEPs will point to implementation issues. So this offers an opportunity to upgrade the scrutiny and challenge function, but it shouldn't just be done by the European Parliament. There needs to be a bringing together of the interested communities here, who are, for example, the Parliament, the Committee of the Regions, the Economic and Social Committee, and there needs to be a joining of forces there to create a more place-based balance to the very heavy top-down orientation of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And there is a risk that domestically there's going to be inertia and disillusionment setting in, even perhaps after the first year or so of the implementation of these plans, especially in those places with the least capacity and have the most firefighting to do. And it's going to be really important to keep that on the radar at the EU level. So that wider cohesion community has a stronger role to play within that. So I suppose with that message is also the fact that the reform agenda is not going to be very effective if it's not owned at a local level. And if the process is not inclusive, this could indeed jeopardise the whole recovery and resilience journey. There's also a need to champion cultural change, and that's not just a problem from a top-down perspective. There's a significant challenge in changing mindsets and changing the ethos towards new and different ways of working and policy solutions, for example, related to governance, how we manage knowledge, expertise, the role of leadership, shifting from old policy responses to, for example, active labour market policies, adopting more intensive public consultation and engagement, and innovation diffusion. And these are things that tend to be not well instrumentalised in the least developed places across the EU. So it's not only a top-down problem, there is a need to get some of that thinking embedded and working and moving at some of these very local levels. I don't have much more to say here because I want to make sure we leave enough time to open up. But I think really a couple of points to leave with is just that I think there is an opportunity to seize the current momentum for the EU's reform agenda. Previously, it was a bad word to talk about reforms at the EU level, but the COVID recovery, the Green Deal, the Recovery and Research Facility, they have created a new appetite for reform. With that, perhaps, is a new role for foresighting actions, and that's something that has come to the fore quite recently from an EU perspective. So there's perhaps more to consider and debate within that agenda. And I think also there's a reality check required around acknowledging and managing the trade-offs. I already mentioned winners and losers, and I think we have to face up to the fact that it's going to be very difficult to avoid that in this green recovery journey. The health pandemic just comes with an inevitable outcome of winners and losers. But this could also create new resistance to the EU project on many levels. There could be resistance to the role of the Council, the role of the EU project. There will be a really significant need to cushion the impacts of the effects in places which stand to lose the most as a consequence of COVID. And there is probably a need for much more honest debate about how we can address some of these rather endemic challenges going forward. So there's roles really for the ongoing debate, discussion, the direction of that debate, how we need to navigate it, and how we provide evidence of what impacts are being felt, particularly in the least advantaged places as we move towards this so-called green recovery. So I'm going to stop talking there and hand back to you now, Marta. So that I'll finish up there. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. I just want to sum up and present some of the key messages we see as takeaways. First, as mentioned, the fact that pre-existing challenges will not disappear. So the focus on COVID and the transition, of course, is very much welcome, but it's not everything. And this transition would have to come on top. And of course, this can also mean that there is opportunities to actually kill two birds with one stone and solve pre-existing vulnerabilities while, for example, incentivizing the green transition and the recovery from the crisis. Funding is, of course, very welcome and much needed in a lot of places. It provides a stimulus and an incentive for needed reforms, which was something that was a bit missing before. But funding alone, however, cannot be the only solution, as Alison has been saying. On the current crisis, this carries the risk of exacerbating fragmentation and divisions between winners and losers. With the first, so the winners, bouncing back from the crisis, engaging successfully with the green transitions, and so creating a more sustainable growth pact, and the latter, so the losers, not be able to do this, and so falling even further behind. So what is really the worst case scenario, which I very much hope will not be realized? A waste of resources, clearly, increasing disparities and political instability. This, of course, does not need to happen. At the European level, there are the tools to avoid this worst case scenario and to provide a sustainable recovery. So for this, we really need a multi-level, multifaceted, targeted approach to different types of areas, and in particular to less advantaged areas, so that we do not waste the opportunity of the funding and the incentive, the reform momentum that is brought by the recovery facility. We'll stop here. Thank you very much, and of course, very much looking forward to comments and contributions. Thanks.
Thank you both, Alison and Marta. This has been a very interesting presentation. I think it gave us a lot of food for thought, maybe a lot of uncertainties, of course, questions that we cannot answer right now, but you presented a very rich picture, starting from how do we actually define lagging regions even pre-COVID times, and then describing this complexity that they're now in with pre-existing but also new and emerging challenges, and the threats that are there, but also the opportunities to actually help more disadvantaged regions to have a more bottom-up or place-based recovery. So thank you a lot for this. Now I see that we already have questions in the chat, so I will start with them. And maybe I can ask Nigel to ask his question himself.
Yes, thank you very much. I would first like to thank both the speakers for a fascinating and certainly topical presentation, which I enjoyed very much. I was interested that you used GDP as a way of defining disadvantaged or lagging areas. And this worries me a bit because I think GDP has for some time been contested as a reliable measure, as a fairly blunt instrument and not reflective of every aspect of well-being. And I wondered whether you considered other, perhaps more nuanced ways of identifying areas which are the most disadvantaged.
Yes, maybe I can take that directly. I could not agree more, Nigel, with what you just said. Absolutely, GDP is not the best indicator we have. There are different reasons why we use this. First is that we wanted to provide a different version of the existing typology that the Commission uses to identify lagging regions, which is based on GDP, which for us was faulted. So we tried to adapt, let's say, to make that typology work without completely changing the whole system. But I absolutely agree that GDP is not the best way to look at this. We have in the paper developed more shortly on different types of indicators. One is still very much economic, which is economic inactivity. So to identify areas where there are significant gaps in, for example, the willingness to work, the possibility to find employment, and so on. And for that, we find anyway quite a strong correlation with the GDP measures. And another indicator that we have developed in the paper is the social progress index. This is not us who has done this index, and it has been applied at European regional level by some work that has been done by DG Regio in cooperation with the Social Progress Imperative, which is a global NGO that has developed the index for the world, actually. This is very interesting index because it puts together everything that is not economic. So it goes really from quality of air to employment opportunities, housing prices. So it really looks at different things to identify the level of social progress in EU regions. The main issue with this way of looking at things is that it's very new. And so we don't have a history of data for this, which is what we were interested on. So our typology builds on GDP performance over time, because lagging for us means that you're not, it's a change indicator. It's not a one-shot sort of a picture in time. And the issue with the social progress index is that there isn't comparability over time because it has been done relatively recently. And so we cannot compare, for example, from year 2000 to this year. But I absolutely agree that well-being needs to be included more. And actually, I think the Commission is, at least in principle, willing to include more measures of well-being that go beyond GDP. We shall see what they will put forward, but yeah, I mean, at least on principle, let's say that they are willing to do this. So let's see.
Thank you both, Nigel and Marta. Kari, would you also like to unmute and ask the question that you've already put in the chat?
Yeah, sure. So it was just on Alison's last point in her presentation, and it was picked up in the kind of worst case scenario bit as well. I just wondered whether the kind of impacts of COVID and the transition could lead to a pushback on the European project, similar to what we saw after the financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis a couple of years ago. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kay. Yes, a really important question, and I think the answer is yes, and it could actually be even worse, especially if we consider that there is a long hangover of problems, lack of reform, lack of effective targeted policy responses in places where, as you say, there were significant long-term problems following the financial crisis. And the fact that these problems were not properly addressed led to, as we know, quite a lot of unrest, Euroscepticism, etc. On top of that, with the health pandemic, we can't really afford to get the responses wrong because the history of that is still rather fresh. The scars are still there. So I don't think it could be just the same. I think it could in fact be even worse in terms of responses across different places in Europe. And it could be pretty bad for the EU project as a whole in terms of its stability, its future direction. So yes, I think that's a key area concern.
Thank you, Alison. Are there further questions that you would like to pose to our two speakers? You can either raise your hand, or we are rather a small group, so if you would wish to unmute and just ask your question. Yes, Tiago, please go ahead.
Hello, good morning. Thanks for the presentation, both presenters. I wanted to ask a question more from someone that comes from an entrepreneurial finance background and has actually done a lot of research on green investment. You are suggesting that we take a multi-country approach to try to smoothen the recovery and then to green to become mainstream or to help the recovery. But I want to question a little bit your argument in terms of doing this in a smooth way, because we know that green is associated with change. We know that countries within the European Union have different levels of adoption of technology, even infrastructures to adopt technology. So could we not take a similar approach with what we have seen in the Industrial Revolution, where you have leading countries that push the countries on the back tail, and from that point onwards gain advantages, rather than everyone trying to do the same thing at the same time and actually not creating not being the most efficient possible. If that's clear, my question. I hope it is.
It is. Marta, you might want to come in on this as well. It's a kind of ongoing debate, and in the face of it, in theory, I wouldn't disagree with what you say, but we do know that the impacts of that will accelerate an uneven recovery, because even with the support that's in place now or is planned to be in place, we know that some places will absolutely accelerate and push ahead, because and no one's saying they shouldn't. But the challenge with that is that if that is at the expense of other places, because they cannot get a foothold, or they cannot, and these are some of the wider issues that we have within the EU around how the single market functions. So where, for example, if you have had access to public financing, where is the conditionality, where is the imperative to then ensure that diffusion of some of that effort goes back in to places where that support is needed. So we're already seeing some of this emerging. So the winners and losers that Marta and I referred to earlier is something which is actually going to happen anyway. It's how big the distance is between those which could create problems for the long-term future of not just the single market, but evidently the EU project. And I think there is a careful balance to be had in there, measuring on the one hand the kind of free hand around industrial policy, and also an entrepreneurial spirit, and not seeking to dampen that, but on the other hand making sure that as a consequence of that, and by default, particular places, and it will be places, are not being left behind. I don't know if that really answers. It's a very general question, but it's a massive area to explore. I'd be keen to hear more of your views on that, or indeed, Marta, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
Maybe just to add that when we say a place-based approach to policymaking, it doesn't mean that all places should be doing the same thing. It means that at least all places should be considered into a policy strategy, which, for example, at EU level, we don't really see. And this is not to say that we should not invest in excellent places or very advanced areas. It's not to say that those areas do not have the right to progress or to become world leaders in this or that technology or sector. It's really to say doing just that is not enough, because if you only focus on the Paris and Milans and Londons of Europe, the rest of the countries will not just trickle down. Doesn't work. Even President Biden said that in a different context. But I think this is applicable to geographies as well. So it's not to say that places cannot become excellent. It's to say, yes, we need to do that, but it has to be accompanied by a development strategy that looks at these areas that might not have any particular endowment, but then nonetheless should, at their own pace, engage with these changes. So we cannot afford that entire regions do not digitalize at all. I'm not saying they should become Silicon Valleys, not even innovation hubs, but still there is a minimum, I would say, a minimum base that everyone should be engaged with.
If I could respond,
Yes.
I think Marta about Marta's argument. Yes, it's true that if it's a long-standing plan for the whole European zone, I think that this is fantastic, and that's what it should be. But I think it's quite important to reinforce the point that at the moment green technology has still a cost. The benefit don't overcome the cost, because people make decisions based on what is beneficial for them, and this is why adoption of green technology is so hard. So if you go into poor regions where people have much less disposable income, then they'll definitely will not do that adoption of technology. So I think what you just said, Marta, I completed the argument. That's true. The plan needs to be seeing the overall perspective of all the EU members, and try to use probably European funds to in the future to then those poor regions to go top notch and adopt those technologies. Thanks for the answer.
Thank you. Are there further participants that don't feel shy today and have a question and would like to pose it? Yes, Wilbert, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Nelly. My name is Wilbert, working at EPRC as well. I was slightly triggered by the question from Nigel, and also Marta's response. I think it was a very good addition to what you mentioned earlier on which indicators to use and when looking at regional disparities. And I was just wondering if you could just hypothesize and taking this a step further on what we mean by disadvantaged areas, based aside from economic indicators on others as well. Last week I was at a very interesting student conference at the University of Delft about mega regional development in the Euro Delta, and a few fascinating maps on environmental issues came up, kind of showing pollution and nitrogen deposition in Northwestern Europe. And it made me and a few other participants wonder, what do we mean by disadvantage? Looking at those maps, Northwestern Europe came up as a disadvantaged area in terms of this, in this case, nitrogen deposition. And I think similar issues came up as well in our previous webinar on trends in well-being and sustainability in regional policies in individual countries. So with this sort of background, I was just wondering if you could imagine or maybe speculate even on how regional maps of disadvantaged or advantaged areas would look like if we do that.
I can add a few thoughts in there, Marta, and then if you want to come in. I think it's a really important issue that you raised, because the idea of talking about disadvantaged regions, territories, places in and of itself is still, in some ways it's relatively new, which sounds ridiculous because I mean it's always been there. Why do we have cohesion policy? But just to go back, for example, to the last cohesion report, the 7th cohesion report, it talked about that it was going to address lagging regions. We talked then about it was this catch-all of lagging regions, and cohesion policy hasn't really done that. When we've looked at the data, it doesn't look like it's helped significantly. So by changing the terminology to disadvantage, what areas of disadvantage are we talking about? As you say, is it environmental disadvantage that we're talking about, which of course should be looked at. But if you take that in depth and you look at the granularity of the data, you will probably come up with a different group of regions than, for example, if we're looking at long-term economic and social disadvantage. So I think that, and I think this is work actually that requires a great deal more effort going forward, which is part of the work that we did around the lagging regions for the European Parliament, was to say we can't stop using these terms, these catch-all terms, to say that there is a group of regions who have all of these problems that aren't. When we talk about disadvantaged regions, we're tending to look at it from the perspective of the lagging regions, as we talked about earlier. They're not, we haven't really looked in depth at the environmental issues within that group of regions. But as I say, it comes back to what is the typology, what is the reason for looking at those groups in any way, or those particular subjects, and what are the policy instruments at our disposal at the EU, national, local level to address these challenges. And what it comes back to is that we still tend to adopt a very top-down approach to policy making, which means that a lot of these issues become hidden. They're not, we're not really aware of them unless they're suddenly put under the spotlight, and then we see the distance between the challenges and the solutions which are already in place. So I think there are instruments going forward, and I think we take the Conference on the Future of Europe, the 8th Cohesion Report, where we actually need to start to unpick this, and we need to talk about the genuine bottom-up approach to policy making, which exposes challenges, whether they are economic, social, environmental challenges, or a combination thereof. It's a very general answer I've given, but I think it's a bigger problem. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Marta.
Maybe just to say that I think when we categorize, for example, regions on the basis of their GDP growth, relative GDP growth, of course, that's as I was saying earlier, it's not enough, not representative of all the issues. But I think still that the GDP performance is a kind of good approximation of different issues that happen in different territories. And unfortunately, I think environment is not one of those, because environmental quality, risk to climate change, these are not related to, for example, GDP related indicators, while instead other things that can help us identify disadvantaged regions are somewhat correlated to GDP performance. And these are, for example, things like administrative capacity, business environment, public investment amounts, but also quality of education, skill base. So there is a set of socioeconomic conditions that are somewhat correlated, at least approximately, with GDP performance. But I agree that environment needs a sort of a special analysis, because as you were saying, there are areas, for example, in Western Europe that are relatively rich and doing well in a variety of other indicators, but that might, suffer from worse environmental related indicators. So I think this is a very good point, and I think we're not there yet. Us, of course, but also like in the policy debate, I don't think we are there yet to really discuss what does environmental quality mean for prosperity and also for just long-term well-being, independent of GDP growth.
Thank you both for addressing this question. We are almost coming to the hour, but I wondered if I can also ask you something, just reflecting on what you've been talking, because you mentioned a few times capacities, and we have on one hand the more disadvantaged regions that I think you also mentioned in the presentation, they're having lower administrative capacities. On the other hand, you talked about the importance of this ownership of the reform, and that it is place-based, that it is done locally. So how do you see this in a way conflict disentangled? Because you especially if we are talking about recovery that we don't want to postpone in long. So any thoughts on this?
The key answer for me here is governance. Because there are some things that should be addressed at a national level if they are national level issues and they affect everyone in pretty much the same ways, then they should be addressed nationally. So it's back to subsidiarity and governance. But the further away we are from the reform agenda and the more you are impacted by change, and you've not been part of that change agenda and understanding what will happen, then the more you will resist it. We saw that with the Gilets jaunes and the energy agenda in France. The answer is not then to back off from the reform agenda. It's about how do you best implement reforms. Personally, I have while I very much welcome the Recovery and Resilience Facility, I have some quite grave concerns about the nature of the investment, because we're effectively paying for many reforms which should have been in place anyway and should already have been addressed at the national level. And when we look at the European semester, which was always supposed to be there to address reforms and to push and encourage and incentivize reform at the national level, and simply didn't work because there was no money behind it, then we have moved to a model where we're saying that the EU pays for the reforms. And I think that's quite a dangerous precedent to be setting. I mean, yes, it's national financing which is behind it, but it's an EU championed model. And I'm not convinced that's the right way forward. Reform has become a really bad word. We've hit a point now where the reform agenda, there is more appetite for it precisely because there is a recognition of the need for it and there is money behind it. Will it work in the long term? I don't know. I really don't know. And in the absence of governance, effective governance, which is really bringing together that top down and bottom up, those dimensions, then there is a very, very strong risk that it won't work. We won't see the recovery, certainly not in the medium term that we're aiming towards. A dismal thought from me, but that's my view nonetheless.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for for being honest, for sharing your thoughts. Okay, so I think that this has been a really very interesting discussion. If there are no further questions, I don't see any raised hands, so I assume there are no. I thank you both for joining us today, for presenting and for responding to all the questions that have been posed. Thank you for all contributors from the public and for all of those who joined us today. Our next webinar will take place Wednesday, 9th of June, when Austin Kilroy, senior economist at the World Bank, and Roberto Ganau, assistant professor at the University of Padua, will be presenting on economic growth in EU NUTS 3 regions. So there's, as usual, opportunity to join this seminar by registering, but also you can subscribe to our mailing list and you can receive a notification when the registration is open. So thanks again, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the discussion today. I wish you a very good rest of the day and to see you soon.
Thank you, Nelly, and thanks everyone for the attention.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.